What we're going to do is we're going to tell folks a little bit about the Boomtown era of Dunnellon. It's the time of the year for the annual Boomtown Festival. We throw a pretty good street party, but we don't really tie it back in with the Boomtown of Dunnellon. Dunnellon was not just a local boomtown, Marion County or the area. It was nationally, internationally known. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit out of our book here, Dunnellon, Boomtown of the 1890s by J. Lester Dinkins. Mr. Dinkins is a good friend of ours. This book has been out of print since 1995. We're working to try and get it back in print so folks better understand the history of the town that we live in. I'm just going to read this one paragraph because it pretty much sums it up. Within a year, Dunnellon has become famous on 2 continents, owing to the discovery in our midst of what is probably the richest phosphate deposits in the world. This discovery, which ranks with that of California's gold and Pennsylvania's oil, was like them brought about by accident. Now, actually, very little of that is true. Dunnellon is not the site of the discovery of phosphate in Florida. Pebble phosphate was discovered about 7 years earlier than that, down in the Peace River, and about 6 years to 7 years before that, phosphate was discovered up in Alachua County. But it was used for building material, and they did not realize that it was a rich source of phosphate-creating fertilizer. In 1889, a fellow by the name of Albertus Vogt, his black laborer, Tom Stark, discovered a substance when they were digging a well. It had the bones encased in it, and as Albertus Vogt tells the story, his laborer came in from lunch and said, "The devil is dead for sure." And Mr. Vogt asked him why. He said, "I found the teeth and the bones of the devil in that hole that I'm digging." When Albertus Vogt went to examine, he found the rock, decided he may be onto something of value, and he filled up a nail keg and took it to Ocala to have it examined by the local chemist in Ocala, Rene Snowden. Now, Mr. Vogt did not know that he had discovered phosphate. He thought that he had found a Jimson deposit. So he was looking to make a buck off his discovery. He just didn't know what he had. Now, there's several versions of the story that go from there, but generally speaking, Mr. Vogt stopped in at the office of John Dunn, who was a local banker and also a railroad proprietor. They looked at that and then decided to have it analyzed by Dr. Snowden. Whenever it was analyzed and it was confirmed that it was the highest grade phosphate known at that time, they knew they were onto something. So they immediately hatched a plan. They jumped on the train, returned to Dunnellon, the 3 of them. They examined the site north of town, a giant rock outcropping, which is now the now ghost town of Rockwell. They examined the rock. They realized that they were onto a very valuable discovery. They hatched a plan with John Dunn, the chemist, Dr. Snowden, Albertus Vogt, and Albertus Vogt's brother to use the funds of Mr. Dunn's bank and buy up all the phosphate-containing lands that they could before anyone caught on. Within the next 30 days or so, they had bought up several thousand acres of land, generated a flurry of activity in Ocala at the county courthouse, because no one could figure out why these guys were running out through the woods, probing rods into the ground, and buying land in vast quantities for no apparent reason. Eventually, there was 2 brothers, the Teague brothers, which were businessmen in Ocala, that came and visited Albertus Vogt's home. Of course, they were not there. They were out in the field working, and they spoke to Albertus's wife, and she was not forthcoming, but it was clear that they were on to what they were doing. There was a lot of tense negotiations that went on, and eventually they invited the Teague brothers in to be partners. Over the next 6 months, they increased their holdings to over 8,000 acres of phosphate-containing land. Towards the end of 1889, the Vogt brothers sold out their holdings and netted $191,000 between the 2 of them for 6 months' work. That ended up being $1,000 a day between the 2 of them in an era when the common labor earned 50 cents a day. Albertus Vogt used his newfound wealth and he spent it with a passion. Eventually, he would go on to become known as the Duke of Dunnellon. He spent his money with a flourish. He was a very charismatic character. Even before he had money, he was a very charismatic character. Very well educated and a very talented writer. After he made his fortune, he went on to create the nicest home, the most fancy, prestigious home in the area. It was furnished with draperies from France, furniture imported from Charleston, had the finest crystals, basically in the middle of nowhere. He had the finest home with the best of everything. He put the best possible team of white horses. He ultimately purchased the Methodist church building and converted into a stable for his horses, which caused some issues with some of the locals, but he bought it and he used it as he saw pleased. He was known as a great hunter, and he actually bought an island, which is now called Bonita Club, and he used the island just as a place to keep his hounds, so when they went to the area they could go fox hunting, and he kept his team of hounds there. He was known to ride into town on his white horse, and it was not unusual for him to hand a $5 gold piece to any black laborer that was standing around just to hold his horse while he went inside to do business. He was known far and wide as a newspaper columnist. He was really well known for his spending habits, and he wrote about how he spent his money, and he was very open about it. Of course, the money ran out before too awful long, and what was then kind of scandalous within the Boomtown Days of that era, in the same year, both his wife and his brother passed away in not too long period of time. Basically about the same time, he lost his brother and his wife in 1901. And what was considered a little bit scandalous, after a grieving period of only a couple of weeks, he married his sister-in-law, and quite conveniently gained back his brother's part of the portion, which his brother did not spend as extravagantly. But Albertus continued. He eventually squandered most of that money. During the bank panic of 1897, the bank that he had invested in, along with John Donne, failed, and he lost a lot of money on that. But Albertus Vogt, always an entrepreneur, promoter, and really charismatic businessman with always interesting ideas to promote what he was doing. After he had burned through his initial fortune and his brother's fortune, after he married his sister-in-law, decided to kind of try to recreate the lightning in the bottle of the phosphate discovery. So he discovered oil. In a little-known fact that was national news at the time, he buried a drum of oil in a local creek, and he had the widow lady that owned the property discover the oil, and there was oil running in the creek. They invited in the editor of the Evening Star, who came immediately on a special train to investigate. They found oil floating in the creek. They soaked it up with a sponge and set the sponge on fire to prove that it was oil. Now, it did prove to be a hoax, but it made all of the papers as far as up north, and some of the northern oil companies sent prospectors. And at one point, they sunk several, of course, dry oil wells, one being in Citronelle, not very far away. Albertus Vogt, for the rest of his life, contended that he did really discover oil, and it's almost humorous now to read back on some of the old newspaper articles, because he openly challenged the oil companies to come drill an oil well here in Dunnellon to prove them wrong. Of course, the oil companies knew it was a hoax, but in order to prove them wrong, they had to come drill an oil well where they knew there was no oil. So we really had him over a barrel, and he was never proved wrong, although there are no oil wells here. An interesting side note, I actually know the family of the widow. Her name was Candace. I'll leave out her last name. It was very interesting how she handled the hoax. The oil companies actually bought all the mineral rights to her farm. So at that time, she was an 80-year-old widow lady, and she was able to sell the mineral rights to her farm, so she got to sell it but keep the farm and use it too. And even into the 1920s and 30s, and probably on to this day, there are still issues with mineral rights on properties that date all the way back to the Vogt gold discovery of 1901. And I've even had a real estate transaction that had mineral rights issues and ended up not buying it. And that probably dates directly back to when the oil companies came in buying up mineral rights for oil under the ground that was never there. So Albertus Vogt, he had a very interesting life, from being a Confederate soldier to surveying for the railroads in the West. He was assistant federal marshal in Jacksonville and was involved in the stolen congressional election of 1876. That's when he moved to the Ocala area. He ran the local stagecoach line, had a citrus grove, was a farmer, real estate salesman, and this is all before he discovered phosphate and became rich. He continued being a widely read newspaper columnist, and eventually got back into the phosphate business for Pebble Phosphate in Pasco County. He bought and ran the Phoenix Hotel down in Pasco County. He had a very interesting history. He was a very charismatic, very interesting man. He was very articulate. He was very smooth in the way he spoke, and he went through numerous fortunes, acquired with sometimes shaky ethics. He died a relatively poor man, and by the end of his life, he had done something interesting. He claimed that he never surrendered as a Confederate soldier, but by the teens, he had run short of funds, and to try and help support his wife after he passed, he applied for and received a pension for being a Confederate soldier, even though he was never paroled and he never surrendered. So that was kind of the way of Albertus Vogt. He owned every side of every story and got away with it. He died in, I believe, 1921, and ended up buried in an unmarked grave. After that rich and interesting life, he ended up buried at Santos in an unmarked grave. So that's the story of the Boomtown Daynellon and Albertus Vogt. We'll delve more into that later, especially the oil hoax. That is unknown, and I think only people that know where that took place, and the remainder of that story is two people that have told it to. And I have not gone to find the exact place yet, if it can even be discovered at all. But part of it is probably now under Lake Russo, the part, I think, where that Grandma Candace's farm was.